Hello BookTube, I'm Jonathan, and today I have a heavyweight sci-fi matchup for you, the Dune series versus the Hyperion Cantos. Now the first book in each of these series are both considered to be science fiction classics, but the sequels are a little bit more polarizing, so I thought it'd be fun to go through them and let you know which of these two series I think is the best. And in order to do that, I'm going to rate each of them by their plot, their world building, their characters, their themes and concepts, and their prose. So let's get into this matchup, starting with the plots. In regard to pacing, in Dune, I felt like all of the books were rather evenly paced, with that pace being slow, whereas in Hyperion, it varied a lot from book to book. In the first book, I felt like the present timeline moved rather slowly, but the tales I felt were rather quick. Then in the Fall of Hyperion, the start of the book is a little bit slow to get going, but once it does, it really moves. Then in Endymion, pretty much all of the book is pretty quick, and in The Rise of Endymion, pretty much all of the book is pretty slow. I think the main strengths of Dune's plotting is in its political intrigue, with all of its scheming and vying for power. However, I do think it relies quite a lot on dialogue and exposition, and there isn't a whole lot of action. The strength of Hyperion is that it has clearly defined objectives for its characters, and you really feel the consequences of the events that happen in the novels. At times in Dune, the timeline is just so sweeping that when it comes to the significant events in the novels, you don't always feel the full emotional weight of them, whereas in Hyperion, I feel like you can really feel the scale and impact. I'd say a weakness of Dune is that Herbert tends to build and build his stories only to quickly wrap everything up in the last 10 pages, whereas I feel like the Hyperion novels have slightly more satisfying endings, although that does vary a little bit from narrative thread to thread, because Simmons does take some rather large swings, and that can result in some amazing hits, but also some confusing misses. I enjoyed the plot development in both of these series, but I wouldn't say it was the primary strength for either of them. In the end, I gave Dune a 7 out of 10, and Hyperion an 8 out of 10. Moving on, we have the world building. Dune is one of the richest worlds in all of science fiction, with its history, religion, even the ecology of the planet Arrakis. These all inform both the themes and the characters, and are central to the story of every single Dune book. Getting to unpack the lore and the balance of power between the different houses, the Bene Gesserit, the Tleilaxu, the Honored Matres, these are all some of the most rewarding parts of reading the Dune series. Now, Hyperion is also a fascinating universe which is connected by Farcaster portals, and I love the various factions, both inside and outside the hegemony, including the Ousters, the Technocore, the Pax, and the Templars, just to name a few. The only thing I didn't love about Hyperion's world building was the retconning done in the second duology. There were a number of things where someone's like, hey, you know what I told you in the first duology? Yeah, that was a lie. I'm going to change a bunch of that. And to be honest, I liked most of the original explanations for things. I really thought only a couple of the retconning moments were actual improvements. But despite that, I think these are two of the best worlds in science fiction. I gave Dune a 10 out of 10 and Hyperion a 9 out of 10. Up next, we have the characters. Dune takes an interesting approach to characters because I think they're well written in the sense that they have both interesting and unique dialogue, but most of them never really felt like real people to me. They felt more like pieces on a chessboard and mouthpieces for different takes on philosophy, which I think works thematically, but I never really cared for them as individuals. There was none that I would be particularly upset about if/when they died. Hyperion, I think, is a little more character-driven. The first book tells us the tales of each of the main characters, so we get to learn their backstories and quite a lot about their personalities. Some of the characters are a bit more interesting than others, but just to pick out a couple, I found Sol to be a very empathetic character, and Martin Silenus, while not the most likable, I found to be rather entertaining. And then when it came to the Endymion duology, we get a bit of a fellowship vibe as Raul, Ania, and Abetic go off on a world-hopping adventure together, and while admittedly Raul is a bit of a boring everyman, I found pretty much everyone else to be rather interesting. To note a couple in particular, we have the Shrike throughout the series, who is definitely an enigmatic character, to say the least, and Father Captain de Sawyer, I think, as to be one of the best antagonists in all of fiction. For characters, I gave Dune an 8 out of 10 and Hyperion a 9 out of 10. And that takes us to the themes and concepts. I think Dune does an excellent job of examining the ways in which philosophy, politics, religion, economics, etc. are all interconnected, and asking the question, what if a certain faction with a certain point of view was to get control over one of these things, and how that would affect the others, and more importantly, what would that mean for society? Hyperion is also rather ambitious with its approach, tackling themes including love, religion, literature, war, and government. I would say that Dune focuses a little bit more on the social sciences, whereas Hyperion also throws a little bit of hard sci-fi in there for you. The technology, including nanotechnology, teleportation, artificial intelligence, I found all to be fascinating. I think this category is a strength for both series, but with Dune, while I found it very interesting, at times it did feel just a little bit academic, whereas with Hyperion, I felt like I connected with it more on a personal level. The Void Which Binds is one of my favorite concepts of all time, and I think the sci-fi concepts just wowed me that little bit more. Also, I don't think I'll ever be able to forget the Tree of Pain or the Cruciform. Here I gave Dune a 9 out of 10 and Hyperion a 10 out of 10. And just before we get to our last category, if you're enjoying the video, consider hitting that subscribe button and helping me on my journey to become the God Emperor of BookTube. Also, if you don't, the Shrike will get you. And finally, the prose. I think both Herbert and Simmons are excellent writers. I find Frank Herbert to be a particularly strong writer of dialogue. I find his books to be rather poetic and very quotable. And I also think he does a great job of creating an atmosphere within his novels. Although he does leave quite a lot to the imagination, in particular when it comes to action scenes, which I feel like he somewhat glosses over. Dan Simmons is also a beautiful writer, and you can see his love of literature, both in the way that he writes, and the way that he incorporates classic literature into the story itself. In a way, the Hyperion Cantos is a love letter to John Keats, which some people might find overbearing, but I actually enjoyed. I also really enjoy the way he writes his scenery. I think when I try to imagine some of my favorite books, my favorite worlds, the imagery from Hyperion is some of the most vivid that comes to my mind. And I also really like the way that he writes his action scenes. There is a particular fight scene at the end of Endymion, which had me on the edge of my proverbial seat. For our final category, I gave Dune an 8 out of 10 and Hyperion a 9 out of 10. So when we add up the totals, that comes to a total score of 42 out of 50 for Dune and 45 out of 50 for the Hyperion Cantos. So it looks like I'm giving the edge to Hyperion, at least when broken into parts, but let's quickly double check this as we compare the scores that I gave to each of the books as a whole. For the Dune series, I gave Dune an 8.5, Dune Messiah an 8, Children of Dune an 8.5, God Emperor of Dune an 8, Heretics of Dune a 6, and Chapter House Dune a 6. And then for the Hyperion Cantos, I gave Hyperion an 8, The Fall of Hyperion a 10, Endymion a 9.5, and The Rise of Endymion an 8. If you're interested in more of my thoughts on these particular books, I'll leave the links for my individual videos on the Dune series and Hyperion Cantos for you in the description. So, that gives us an average rating of 7.5 for the Dune series and 8.88 for the Hyperion Cantos. However, seeing as I didn't particularly love the last two books in the Dune series, which do start a new arc, if we drop those two scores from the average so we can compare 4 books to 4 books, that brings the score for the Dune series up a little closer to Hyperion with an average of 8.25. So there you go, either way you look at it, in the end, my winner was the Hyperion Cantos. Although I would recommend reading both series. I think they share some strengths, but I would suggest Dune for the philosophy and politicking, and Hyperion for the action and technology. Let me know in the comments whether you are Team Dune or Team Hyperion. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you really enjoyed it, consider checking out the perks of becoming a Patreon member, where you can become one of my robots, androids, or cyborgs, like Nima, a New Eden, Half-Ogre, Zakawe, and the Consul Colin. And you can find more sci-fi content over here.